warm welcome to all of you. My name is Ulrike Rösler, and I would like to welcome you at Wolfson College for the 9th Aris lecture in Tibetan and Himalayan studies. The Aris lectures were established in 2015 to celebrate the contributions of Michael and Anthony Aris to the field of Tibetan and Himalayan studies. We are very grateful to those who have generously helped to endow these lectures so that we are able to remember the work of both Aris brothers on an annual basis. Both Michael and Anthony were pioneers in their field. Michael Aris had spent several years in Bhutan as a tutor to the children of the Bhutanese royal family. After his return to the UK, he was the first to teach Tibetan language and history at Oxford, even before a university program in Tibetan and Himalayan studies existed. His twin brother, Anthony, is well known as a publisher, first with the publishing house Aris and Phillips, and later Serindia, which has produced the most magnificent volumes on Tibetan and Himalayan culture and art. He was also a close friend and supporter of the Tibetan Studies program here. Sadly, neither Michael nor Anthony are with us anymore, but we are delighted that so many members of the Aris family are here today, and I'd like to extend a special welcome to all of you. Thank you. Next year, we will hold the 10th Aris lecture, and it will also be 10 years since Anthony passed away, and I imagine we will want to celebrate this occasion in some special way that still needs to be decided. In addition to their professional careers, Michael and Anthony Aris were also the driving forces behind the creation of Tibetan and Himalayan studies as an academic subject at the University of Oxford. While Tibetan studies is fairly well established nowadays in other European countries, in America and in Asia, it is very thinly spread in the UK. As far as I'm aware, Oxford is the only place left in Britain where students can receive systematic training in Tibetan language, both classical and spoken, alongside a wide range of courses on Tibetan history and culture, including Tibetan literature and Tibetan religious traditions. This makes the existence of our department even more precious, and we are grateful to the Aris brothers and to the Rousing family for developing the idea to establish a program dedicated to Tibet and the Himalayan regions, and for generating the funding that is always needed to establish and maintain our academic work. Let us hope that Oxford may be able to pass on this legacy and nurture the next generations of scholars in our field for many years to come. But now it is really time to turn to the Aris lecture. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Martin A. Mills. After positions at the universities of Edinburgh, St. Andrews, and Sussex, Martin Mills now holds a chair in anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. His research focuses on the anthropological study of Tibetan communities, and in particular, their religious and governmental institutions. His book on identity, ritual, and state in Tibetan Buddhism has become a classic in this field. He was made a Fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute in recognition of his achievements. In addition to his academic role, Martin Mills is also the director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research, an interdisciplinary research centre that provides briefings to policymakers and parliamentarians, and in particular to the Scottish Parliament's cross-party group on Tibet. The centre's latest publication is a report on climate change on the third pole, causes, processes, and consequences. And if you're interested, the report is available open access online, and of course this is a very timely and very important topic. Today, however, Martin Mills will take us back into the past with a lecture on Tibetan visions of history in Songtsen Gampo's biographies. The 7th century king Songtsen Gampo plays a crucial role in the Tibetan consciousness. He is credited with several major reforms, including the introduction of Buddhism, the creation of the Tibetan alphabet, and a set of new laws and administrative structures. The lecture today will present brand new results of Martin Mills' current book project on King Songtsen Gampo. Martin, may I invite you to the stage, and would you please join me in making this presentation?
Thank you. Ulrika, thank you very much. I would just like to say thank you for the care in particular in which you have overseen this project. I suppose as today's, since we're in Tibetan studies, as today's ritual performer, it's my job to sort of, how should we do this in Buddhist studies, dedicate the merit of this to the Aris family as the Jindak, as the sponsors, to Ulrika, to Wolfson, of course, as the host, and to the University of Aberdeen, the University of Oxford. It's always lovely to be here. It's a great place, and yes, you do more Tibetan studies than we do in Aberdeen, and that's a shame. We'll beat you eventually, though. Today I want to talk, I do an awful lot of policy-related research, but actually in my heart of hearts, I'm a Tibetan specialist, and my doctoral research was spent in a Geluk monastery in 7 days' walk from the nearest road in Ladakh in the Zanskar Mountains. And my true love here is ritual studies. And so what I really wanted to talk about today is Songtsen Gampo, who's a figure that just keeps turning up in my life until eventually I decided I should write a book. Songtsen Gampo, as Ulrike pointed out, is a key figure. To a certain extent, in a funny kind of way, he's one of those things that no matter what Tibetans argue about, they all agree that Songtsen Gampo's importance, on his centrality as the figure that the king, the emperor, the Tsenpo, that, let's run through, founded Lhasa. Okay, a lot of people just don't know that simple fact. Lhasa, as a place, of course, the name means the place of the gods. And the original word Lhasa was applied simply to the temple that he built there and the city built around it. He introduced the Tibetan written script through Tonmi Sambota. Arguably, although there is great debate on this one, I appreciate, and he is credited with introducing the first written laws, and many of the post-dynastic texts give him that credit. Oversaw the translation of the first Buddhist scriptures into Tibetan, built the Jokhang, the Ramoche, and the Tanduk temples, the first three great temples of Tibet, Buddhist temples of Tibet. He is generally credited with unifying central Tibet. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's largely a story. That's largely a story of his grandfather and his father, and he comes along a little bit later in that one. And he's generally seen as incorporating most of the Tibetan plateau under Yarlung rule. In fair and honesty, that is actually something which occurs later after his life. But nonetheless, he secures that. So in this sense, building the great temple, founding the first laws, producing the written form, I often sort of struggle. In a British context, I have to sort of sit there and say, well, he's kind of King Arthur, as it is to the British. I don't think that's quite enough, actually, to be honest. A closer thing, and I appreciate, I don't want to get into politics of this question, but there we go. It's closer to say he's actually King David to Israel, in that deeper structural sense, and particularly the focus in particular in the post-dynastic texts on the temple building. So in this sense, he is a key. And I've often found that, you know, as long as, the minute people hear Tibetans hear I'm writing a book on Songtsen Gampo, there tends to be this kind of like, oh, well, you're okay then, kind of feel, which is lovely, I hasten to add, you know, because, you know, he is quite a hero of mine. The problem with it is, of course, is that there are all of these deep questions about, well, what actually did happen in Songtsen Gampo's reign? Because as far as that's concerned, the Tibetan sources are complex. We can really look at it at those sources that exist within what is often referred to as the empire period from the 7th to the 9th century. And then there are those much more substantial and influential works which follow that, the collapse of the early Tibetan empire that Songtsen Gampo and his father and his descendants set up. And then we see a very fecund period of time in which another set of texts in particular that center on works such as the Pillar Testament, revealed, perhaps not written in 1049, the Compendium of Manis, the Mani Kabum, for example, one of the most substantial visionary works that really was based to a large extent on the work of the Pillar Testament. And later kind of sort of rationalizations of that, such as the Clear Mirror of Royal Genealogies in the 14th century. And all of these texts present one view of Songtsen Gampo. In particular, Songtsen Gampo as a divine manifestation of Chenrezig, of Arya Avalokiteshvara, the great protector, the celestial protector of the Tibetan Plateau, of whom the Dalai Lamas are reincarnations that exist at the center of the transformation, not simply of the people, not simply of the animals, but the very land itself is transformed into a Buddhist place. And all of that is seen to have been done by Songtsen Gampo. And then, by comparison, we have these relatively contemporaneous texts, such as the Old Tibetan Annals, to a certain extent, the Tibetan Chronicle, which is really a poem and is a little bit more literary in form. The Old Tibetan Annals are actually more bureaucratic in nature, so people kind of look at them and go, it's bureaucracy, it must be true. I'm not sure how that works in our minds, but it does. And then we have some texts about halfway along, such as things like the Wajé, for example, and the Bajé texts, which are linked sets of texts, that are about kind of halfway. Now, the problem here is that those early texts present quite a brutal picture of life in the first imperial period. It's a period where the Yarlung Empire, sorry if I put this in Tibetan, I stole this slide from a talk that I had to give to Tibetan school children. In central Tibet, we have Lhasa up here, just to give you the Yarlung Tsangpo River that goes along there, and to the south of it, the Yarlung Valley. And this is where the Pergal dynasty emerges. It really has its first substantial entrance into history with Songtsen Gampo's grandfather. And later we have an expansion under his father that takes territory to the north here and gradually builds a whole series of either military conquests or alliances with most of the surrounding area, so most of the surrounding kingdoms. At this point in time, the central Tibetan plateau is divided up. So we have, for example, Tsangpo over here, Nipo up here. We have the difficult to assess Shangshung over here, a very large confederation whose kind of eastern extent we understand, but whose western extent we can't estimate. And consequently, during this period of time, we have the expansion of the Yarlung into, particularly the first expansion under Songtsen Gampo's father is into Nipo to the north, but an alliance here with Tsangpo to the west. And these are quite brutal. You know, the previous king of Tsangpo, for example, the text demonstrates was strangled and then beheaded by the person that would then go on to ally with the Yarlung. Songtsen Gampo himself is described, the first act he deals with is the rebels that assassinated his father. There is some suggestion that as part of the battle for Songtsen Gampo's throne in Lhasa, he burnt his brother to death. I would hasten to add, there's only one source there that suggests that. But one of the things that really comes out of the early texts, of the early sources, is that this was an utterly brutal time. So it's a little like, watching an episode of Rome. This really is a kind of Game of Thrones in that sense of the term. Now, this tends to give a sense of a kind of realpolitik that historians really like. Okay, they like that kind of stuff. They enjoy it. By comparison, the later texts present a really different picture of Songtsen Gampo's reign. Most particularly I'm going to start here really with the Pillar Testament. This text here, the Testament of Wa, possibly the 11th century, is the first to make the claim of Songtsen Gampo's divinity as Chenrezig. That's the first time we see this. The Pillar Testament massively elaborates on that idea in a way which is really remarkable as a text that seems to come out of nowhere. There are two sort of major sources from it. Famously, it is meant to have been revealed by Atisha Dipankara, a Bengali scholar that visited Lhasa and found it in one of the pillars of the Jokhang temple. And it became a terma, a revealed treasure. There are a lot of other stories that sort of said, well, actually, it was given to him as a gift by the mad woman of Lhasa, Nyuma, who was herself an adjudicator of law cases. To be honest, for a variety of reasons, I do find that personally a little more convincing, because the text requires such detailed knowledge of Lhasa and its surrounding area, that it couldn't have been really written by somebody who had sort of, in a sense, just arrived. But this corpus produces a picture of Songtsen Gampo's reign in which there is significant divine manifestation. So Songtsen Gampo himself is seen as a tulku, an emanation of Chenrezig, of Arya Avalokiteshvara. Chenrezig occasionally directly intervenes in the story to protect Songtsen Gampo's reign. There is a huge, complex, sophisticated narrative of the king's capacity to produce magical, illusory soldiers, craftsmen, monks, armies. Similarly, there are demonic attacks and disturbances. There is no discussion of warfare or rebellion. So the empire comes into being and is rendered full without conflict. And finally, there is the long-standing notion of the texts, such as the Pillar Testament, were themselves revealed treasures written by Songtsen Gampo himself. So 400 years later, these texts emerge, written in this form, and the author is meant to be Songtsen Gampo, and it's found in the pillar of the Jokhang temple. Okay, so suddenly we have this dramatically different picture of Songtsen Gampo's reign, and historians don't like it. They get cross, which is fair, Here I'm going to pick A.I. Vostrikov's famous statement. This one turns up in absolutely every single book that is written on this subject, so in which he says, "This doubtless is the biggest defect of Tibetan historical literature. In describing the past, especially the remote past, Tibetan historians cannot always distinguish facts from myths, what is historical from what is legendary, and often mix one with the other. This is mainly observed in the works of Tibetan writers on ancient India, on the initial period of Tibetan history, so Songtsen Gampo's reign, and on the life and exploits of more ancient and honored teachers of Buddhism, such as Padmasambhava." Vostrikov's view is generally widely shared. There's this subtle disappointment that runs through historical discussions of the Mani Kabum, of the Pillar Testament, of the Sawe Melong, of the Clear Mirror of Royal Genealogies. And we can see this in various different forms. So, for example, we have Giuseppe Tucci's who gets cross at a disregard of the historical facts by the religious community, only eager to glorify Songtsen Gampo as a god. Per Sørensen's work, which, by the way, I've drawn on very heavily here. I don't want to imply that this is a criticism, although I will be criticizing it. But, you know, these are great scholars. He complains that the tendency to recast or redress in an outfit manufactured by his posterity in order to create a mythic figure imbued with supernatural endowments as becomes an august monarch of national stature, which I don't wholly disagree with, but there we are, Michael Aris. An exclusively Buddhist viewpoint to celebrate the past glories of clans and principalities, religious schools, cults, and monasteries, and the Tibetan state itself. The histories met and continue to meet the urgent need for legitimizing present conditions or aspirations through a vigorous assertion of past authority. Now, I'm going to try and take a slightly different approach today, because all of these viewpoints, quite legitimately, but I do think incorrectly, start from a religious studies perspective. They start from a Buddhist studies perspective. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I spent 10 years running a religious studies department, so that's fine. But does it really help us understand these texts? In general, all of the texts begin from Vostrikov onwards with an assumption that there is a religious truth and there is a secular truth. And the religious truth at some point has come along and barged out the secular truth. And the secular truth was one of brutality and conflict and war and fratricide and all of those kinds of things. And it's been replaced by a religious truth. And that is quite a standard thing in the religious studies framework. One can see this, for example, in discussions of things like the use of the terms like supernatural, the assumption that this is a Buddhist viewpoint in the sense of religious versus secular. And all of that, to a certain extent, assumes a modern viewpoint on the relationship between religion and politics, which certainly wasn't shared in the medieval Tibetan perspective. The medieval Tibetan perspective, as many will know, was characterized, if they had a single constitutional principle, it was the principle of Chosi Zungdro, the unification of the religious and the temporal. Sometimes called the difference between church and state, but that's not right. It's the idea that there are eternal religious truths that inflect upon the present moment of our lives in a temporal way. Okay, so it's a little bit more philosophically subtle than the simple kind of American constitutional position, as it were. So, rather than looking at it today from a religious studies perspective, I'm going to take my other hat on, because for a while I taught in the politics and IR department, international relations department, and I'm going to look at it from a politics perspective. Does Songtsen Gampo's life story resonate with how we think about political history? And I would argue very strongly that it does, and that much of the apparently supernatural material in Songtsen Gampo's work does things that we read about every day when we read a modern political history. But because they do it in a specifically Tibetan way, we kind of go, well, we don't understand that. So I'm going to try and make that bridge today. It does this in two or three different ways. The first is, in particular, that it has a particular interest in what's called layered history. Okay? The second is that it has this slightly annoying thing that it talks about emanations, trulwa, illusory manifestations in the form of large armies and craftsmen and monks that illusorily go and do the king's bidding. And those are the things that kind of tend to annoy people. Well, let's start with layered history. Okay, sorry, if you didn't bring your glasses today, I'll read this out. Let's start with, I'm going to start with the Clear Mirror. The Clear Mirror is one of the most developed texts on this one. It is a 14th century text, but each of the texts from the Pillar Testament onwards talk about history in a particular kind of way, and they're very explicit about it, okay? And this is quite new. So it starts with for example, discussing Songtsen Gampo's birth. And it says, from this event, 3 viewpoints arose. In the perception of the Buddhas of the 10 directions, it appears that by the power of the preceding prayers of the sublime Chenrezig, having planned the liberation of sentient beings in the snow land of Tibet, had looked upon this precious place like a lamp shining upon the darkness of ignorance in this wild outlying country. And in the perception of the Bodhisattvas, I'm sort of going to hope that is the sort of religious heroes who remain in samsara but are in a celestial form. In the perception of the Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions, it appeared, I'm going to go here and read this so that I don't turn my back on you since that seems rude. In the perception of the Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions, it appears that Chenrezig, for the sake of establishing in religion the sentient beings of the wild snowlands of Tibet, by manifesting an emanatory king, Trulwe Gyalpo, by manifesting an emanatory king, benefited each according to their predisposition for being tamed. In the perception of the common lay people, it actually says the black-headed ones, but that really translates as sort of common lay people, it appeared that a son, wondrous and without compare, had been born to the king. In each of these major texts and life stories of Songtsen Gampo, it stops and uses this form. So every time, for example, it said he founded the temple, 3 views arose. There were the view of the Buddhas, the view of the Bodhisattvas, and the view of ordinary people. And it keeps doing this. Every time Songtsen Gampo does anything major in his rule, the text stops and does this. It's very explicit. It's very systematic, okay? And this is something that I do want to push across to this. Particularly the Pillar Testament is a work of extraordinary authorial originality. We don't see anything like it before that. And in that sense, I want to kind of point towards these writers as rhetorical polemicists, as people that weren't just, as Vostrikov sort of saying, oh, well, they told us that this was true, so we're going to write it down. They were sitting there writing a philosophical work, like, for example, on history, like Hegel was with the phenomenology of spirit. They were engaging in an endeavor to understand their history and to write it in a particular way. And this is one of the mechanisms that they use. So history isn't one, it's 3 layers. A layer from the perspective of the Buddhas, what the Buddhas see, a layer from the perspective of the Bodhisattvas, and a layer from the perspective of ordinary people. And they always look a little bit different. I shan't go through all 7 of them in each text, but it's not something that's totally unusual to modern historians. Modern historians quite regularly do this. If anyone's familiar with, for example, Brodell's History of the Mediterranean, he sits there and argues a similar kind of thing. History needs to be understood in several layers. There's what he calls the longue durée, which is what the Mediterranean book is about. It's a very large book, but well worth a read. He says, this is, well, I'll skip slightly. He says, most of us are familiar with this one here, événementiel, l'histoire événementielle, a history of courte durée, of life in politics. It's the Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris. Okay, it's the shift of one queen to a king. It's life in court. It's, in a sense, what is often referred to as great man history. Okay, it's the history of very large political figures and political leaders in our life. And one of the things that Brodell was interested in is he just sort of sat there and said, well, that's great, but those are little rivulets, those are little ripples on the great sea of history. The bigger, deeper currents that you can't see are the transformations of economy, environment, all of these kinds of things. And they're occurring underneath the surface, and this is something he calls longue durée history. By contrast, there is the final one, which is quotidian history, everyday history, okay? We don't tend to read in a book that it was, for example, what JFK had for breakfast the morning he was assassinated, okay? Because it's not a big event. We talk about the negotiation he had the previous day, yes, but the quotidian things of life are left alone. When it comes to these kinds of writings, Brodel argued that this was more about ordinary people. That was the life of our ordinary lay people, our common lay people. Their work patterns, their meal times, their hygiene patterns, their clocking on time for work, their clocking off time for work. That was quotidian history. And Brodel argued each of these had different causal structures. What causes this thing to move forward is a different structure from what causes this thing to move forward. That's geology, environment, all of those kinds of processes. This is politics and negotiation. This is getting up in the morning and wondering what you want for breakfast. And you have to talk about them separately. Now, what's interesting is the writers of the Pillar Testament were doing exactly the same. They were sitting there actually, oops, I'm going to go back here. They were sitting there and saying, well, the Buddhas thought about things karmically. The Bodhisattvas thought about things as emanations. The ordinary everyday people thought about things in royal terms. And those are three different layers of history. Now, we know that this layering of history is not an uncommon thing, and it's crucial to political history. Just to give you a moment of art history, this is the Portinari altarpiece, to be found in Florence. It was commissioned by Portinari, who was a banker and an important scion of the Medici family. Okay, and he commissioned Hugo van der Goes to produce a depiction of the Nativity of Christ. And indeed, here we have Christ and Mary and the angels and the shepherds. But what's interesting about it is this is a depiction, of course, of great biblical time. But who's this? Well, this is Portinari. That's Portinari's wife. That's Portinari's daughter. And that's his two sons. And what they're asserting here is they are so faithful that they exist in this upper time of biblical time, that they were present. They're so faithful that they are in some crucial sense present at the birth of Christ. And they put this thing up in the center of Florence as a major political gambit. So, talking about your place in complex history is a way of talking politics. Okay. Note, by the way, here, they're all just outside the edges of the triptych. Okay, they don't make it into the center. They were humble enough for that. And so this way of constructing history is something that, particularly in the visionary text of Songtsen Gampo, the writers are writing about with great explicitness. They're being really careful, and they write about it again and again. They are trying to tell the reader that this is how history is organized and how they have to think about Songtsen Gampo. You can actually, often many chapters finish with a statement that says, and this is how you should think about it. So the text is, in a sense, didactic. Right. Okay, so that's item number one. And the point that I want to make in a very simple way is this cosmology, which looks a little different. So the Buddhas of the 10 Directions tend to think things, that's discussed in karmic terms, in classic Buddhist karmic terms. The Bodhisattva material is lights and emanation, and the ordinary people is royal activity. What's really interesting about these three texts is that the narrative is overwhelmingly about these two and not about that one. They don't talk about it in terms of what the Buddha would say. They're interested in what the Bodhisattva would look at, because the king is a Bodhisattva. So they're quite careful with this. Now, that's item number one. The second, which really annoyed Vostrikov, is the whole story about emanations. Not only the king being an emanated king, but his capacity to produce illusory watchmen and guards and soldiers and monks. And actually this also annoyed Tucci when he was looking at Marpa's and Milarepa's biography as well. That one turns up there, and he sort of says, they aren't magically produced, they were produced by his purse. Well, okay, the term here is this one. In the earlier text we see this version, trull. Later we see this term also pronounced trull, but it comes in a longer form. This term, the king Trulwe Galpo, an illusory king, is used prior to speak about non-Buddhist in non-Buddhist texts. This spelling is more common in the Buddhist texts, and there's a subtle distinction between them. There seems to be a lot of evidence that this concept of the king being a trulwa and using emanation was a crucial skill of any leader. Their capacity to produce illusions was a necessary piece of political skill and craft. And this turns up again and again and again. So you can translate the term in lots and lots of different ways. In both of those forms, in a text like the Pillar Testament or the Mani Kambun, you'll often come across pages where they will use the adjective illusory in a single page 30 or 40 times. It's a constant, almost an adjective to anything that's involved here. Now, I'm going to skip forward a bit. Now, this is the one thing that Vostrikov and Tucci and so forth really don't like. I'm going to cut to the chase with the argument, though. It's because it's something we do all the time. Okay? And we do it in what Thomas Carlyle famously called great man politics. Okay? For those of you unfamiliar with Carlyle's writings, he was an essayist back in this was quite early, 1841. That's incorrect. It's 1841, not 1941. I hadn't had enough coffee this morning. Universal history, the history of what man has accomplished in this world is at bottom the history of great men, was Carlyle's perspective. This was actually part of a long series entitled Hero Worship. He was the guy who actually introduced the phrase hero worship. And what he says is, look, basically all history is created by great figures, okay? And everybody else is kind of dawdling along behind. The general mass of common lay people, their lives are patterned and shaped by these great figures. And of course, if you look at his essays, the ones he picks out, the one that he loves, of course, is Napoleon. Napoleon, that great figure, the great emperor. So why don't we pick a second emperor? Let's go for a second emperor. And we do know that when writing the history of such emperors, funny things happen to personhood. So, for example, Hegel, upon meeting Napoleon at Jena in October 1806, the day before the battle, so the 13th, that is, meets him and immediately goes back and meets him on the street and immediately goes back and writes to his friend Johannes and says, I saw the emperor, this world soul, Weltziel, riding out of the city on reconnaissance. It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see an individual who, concentrated here at a single point, astride a horse, nonetheless reaches out over the world and masters it. Okay, well, we don't have to follow Hegel in being quite that heart-fluttered. But nonetheless, if I'm going to go the other side, we'll go from Hegel to Wikipedia. Why not? All right? Wikipedia's description, which I nicked this morning from off the web, for his description of the French capture of Alexandria. On the night of the 1st of July, Bonaparte, who was informed that Alexandria intended to resist him, rushed to get a force ashore without waiting for the artillery or the cavalry to land, in which he marched on Alexandria at a head of 4,000 or 5,000 men. At 2 a.m., the 2nd of July, he set off marching in 3 columns. On the left, Menu attacked the triangular fort where he received 7 wounds, while Kleber was in the center in which he received a bullet in the forehead but was only wounded. Lucky. And Louis-André Bon on the right attacked the city gates. If you actually go later to the Britannica's discussion of, for example, Napoleon's conflict with the Austrian army, it actually says Napoleon chased the Austrian army over most of northern Italy. Now, here's the thing. We know what they mean, but we don't necessarily know what Tibetan writers mean. We know what they mean when they engage in the thing that says Napoleon chased the Austrian army, apparently on his own, okay? That he marched in 3 columns at the head. We note the way in which a leader embodies their followers and soldiers. We can talk about this. Let's go for a slightly closer to hand one. This is the Britannica's discussion, my apologies to anyone from Norway here, of the Encyclopedia Britannica's description of Hitler's invasion of Norway. Hitler garrisoned Norway with about 300,000 troops for the rest of the war. By occupying Norway, Hitler had ensured the protection of Germany's supply of iron ore from Sweden and had obtained naval and air bases with which to strike at Britain if necessary. Now, the interesting point about this, of course, is that, well, all right, Hitler did actually go on a little sightseeing tour of Norway in 1934. But he certainly never turned up in Norway during the Second World War. And yet, he managed to invade it. Now, I know it's a flippant point, but it is important to understand we're talking about language and what language means here. When we say Hitler invades Norway, we mean Hitler sitting in his bunker, although probably in 1940 he wasn't, but there we are, gives instructions to his generals. His generals mull that over and argue amongst themselves and agree to do what they say. They pass orders down the line to colonels and so forth, all the way down through a variety of intermediate things, some of whom argue, some of whom restructure the plan, some of whom produce alternatives, some of whom simply resist and possibly get shot, all the way down to the ordinary privates and corporals on the ground, all of whom, by history's language, are Hitler. Okay? Now, this is a point because what we do in this language is something which is referred to philosophically as foreshortening. We've effectively taken this amazingly complicated and politically tricky, because it doesn't always work out, ask Slobodan Milosevic, this incredibly tricky process which involves multiple pieces and multiple steps, and reduce it down to the intentionality and action of a single figure. And that's called foreshortening in philosophical terms. It's the way in which I foreshorten, for example, I intend to wave my hand. And I have foreshortened all of the neurons, all of the sodium atoms, all of the leverage of the arms, all of the things that make that happen, all the way down to I intend to move, I move. Okay? And philosophically, it's referred to as foreshortening. Foreshortening is something we see explicitly in the Tibetan texts. The first emanation that Songtsen Gampo produces in the narratives is of the monk Akaramatashila. That is, the monk bound to a duty, all right, to a discipline. I'll translate this, but I put the Tibetan up for the Tibetan members of our audience. Then the king thought, no person, me, can be found that can invite, and the purpose was here to go and get the first statue of Chenrezig and bring it to Tibet. And that statue was understood to be in Sri Lanka. Okay? And that was a very long journey to go and find a little statue. And he goes, well, no one could be found to invite my personal deity. Surely a trulwa, an emanation, is necessary. Immediately, from the tuft between his eyebrows, the king's eyebrows, an emanatory monk called Akaramatashila, on whose head sat the Buddha, Amitabha, was manifest and sent away to invite the personal deity. Okay? Now we find that is in the 14th century version. What's interesting is if you look at the earlier versions of the same story. Let's go back all the way to the Pillar Testament. The Pillar Testament presents a slightly longer and more complicated one. When I say slightly longer, I mean quite a lot longer. Contemplating the prospect of inviting this god, so a little statue of Chenrezig, across empty plains along with encountering terrifying savage animals, the king, in order to invite that compassionate manifestation of deity, cast out a ray of resplendence from between his eyebrows, which dissolved into the heart of that high-born Skion, the daughter of the king's interior minister, Dongsa Trinsun, immediately after the full moon of the 6th or 7th month. The emanated monk called Akamatashila was born, who furthermore bore upon his crown a seated emanation of Amitabha. From between the king's eyebrows, a ray of white light was sent south, like an arrow over the horse pass, inviting the royal father's tutelary deity. Then the emanatory monk went south. So, in the latest version, it happens like that. Arguably, in the original version, it takes a pregnancy and 20 years. In other words, the causal process has been foreshortened to make it look entirely like Songtsen Gampo's immediate doing without those nasty little intermediate steps. Okay? And this is common to statements of political and political sovereignty. Intentional foreshortening is how we historically write that, and it is how historically the 11th century Tibetan writers seem to have been doing it too. So, argument number one, what we're really talking about here is not magic any more than Hitler invaded Norway is magic. We're talking about a way of writing history which is shared, but here they simply use the particular trope, trulwa, illusory manifestation, to do the same job. Now, we know this in more precise detail, thankfully, from both the Pillar Testament, but also the Clear Mirror. Here I've chosen from the Clear Mirror, because it actually explains the whole business of light. The light came out from between his eyebrows. Well, the text actually tells you what that means. It says, for example, so it goes back in history and it talks to the life of the Buddha, and it said, well, the Buddha sat there and was thinking about giving a teaching, and the gods appeared around him and asked him to give a teaching. Thus, being thus entreated, the conqueror, Shakyamuni, by smiling joyfully, radiated light rays of 4 kinds. 1 touched Brahma, 1 touched Vishnu, and 1 touched Indra, and 1 touched the artisan. By this, the intention to speak was born in them, whereupon this is then followed by 4 lengthy speeches giving Buddhist teachings. Now, actually, you find this in these visionary texts all the time. The metaphor of light touching somebody, going from somebody and touching somebody else, is a metaphor for inspiration, for someone sharing the same inspiration, the same intention. Okay? And they're quite clear on this on several points, actually, and this is what is most interesting about reading this text in the original. They almost stop every once in a while and say, so you need to understand it like that. Okay? So one of the things they're saying is, Songtsen Gampo is sovereign over that first manifest monk, and I can send that person because unlike anybody else, that person shares exactly the same intention as me. Okay? Now, we actually find this is the next interesting bit about the emanatory process in these narratives. It gets quite wild quite fast. And throughout the course of Songtsen Gampo's life, and particularly his founding of the Jokhang temple in Lhasa, his power to create emanatory anything multiplies. Okay? So we start, picks up his tutelary statue of Chenrezig, which is going to go in the Jokhang. That creates 1. He sends ambassadors to China and to India, to Nepal and to China, and says, well, we'd like your princesses, please. That would be nice, in marriage to the king, in marriage to Songtsen Gampo. And if you don't, and while you're there, you can give us all of your architectural techniques as well. And you can give us your laws, because we need to work on building those too. And you can give us a variety of other things. And if you don't, but we get them anyway, I will produce 50,000 illusory soldiers that will come and lay waste to your cities. So there they're saying quite explicitly, if I get these constitutional powers, I will be able to produce illusory soldiers. Now, actually, this is a general theme throughout the work. As Songtsen Gampo builds more and more constitutional powers related to Chenrezig, the law, the language, the first temple, the tutelary statue, as he becomes more and more a ritual king, he can emanate more and more things. So, building the binding temples, let's say construction and consecration of, there are 50 illusory guards, protecting the Jokhang while it is built, and inside the Jokhang there are 50 illusory craftsmen who are busy building the inside of the craftsmen. But they still have to eat. That's actually described. They all receive meals and so forth. So they're kind of real in some way, but they're illusory in another. Finally, we get, after he has introduced his laws, we get to the point of the tale of the Khotanese monks. I shan't go into this in great detail. 2 monks from Khotan hear that Songtsen Gampo is Chenrezig. So they go on pilgrimage to meet him. When they arrive in central Tibet, they find the place a complete bloodbath. They find everybody chained up and tortured and murderers with their heads chopped off and walls of corpses all over the place. And they go to a little old lady, because there's always a little old lady who'll tell you what's going on. All right? They turn up and this little old lady is there and they say, "What's going on? We thought this guy was Chenrezig and he was really nice." And they're like, and she goes, "Well, that's his new laws. And we're all terrified of him. And we're all getting executed. And he's really draconian." And famously, they then then try and run away, and Songtsen Gampo has them hauled back by guards. And they're thrown in front of him, and he says, "What was the problem?" And they kind of go, "We're really frightened of you now, because you seem to be, we thought you were a really nice, compassionate bodhisattva king. And actually, all of this has happened." And he goes, "Let me show you." He says, "Actually, all of these are simply emanations. The guards, the judges, the executioners, even the victims themselves, all of them are emanations designed purely to scare the Tibetan people into obeying the law. They're not real." Actually, in a 16th century text, he pulls back his collar and he says, "Look, all the ones you saw executed, in the end of the day, all of them come back into my body, and you can see all the 1,000 cuts across my neck." It's a very famous story that occurs in various different forms. By the time we get to the end, and Songtsen Gampo has achieved everything, the clear mirror says this: by acting in this way, the rulers and subjects were happy. The teachings and kingdom expanded into the 10 directions. Through the enactment of the religious laws, the subjects listened. By the actions of the divine ruler of men, Songtsen Gampo, the entire kingdom became happy. Heroes, swift horses, and enjoyments became equal to the gods. Through the practice of the true doctrine, they became happy in this and the next life. By giving up quarrel and strife, everyone knew one another as father and mother. By learning writing, the Buddha's teachings spread. Lacking non-virtuous spiritual friends, they profited from the jewel of the 10 virtues. Thus carrying on their crown, this being carried on the crown of everybody's head, the sun of happiness dawned. As all were emanational creations, there were no tax or corvée service duties. Now, this is really interesting because you do find this. In the story, the emanatory capacity is actually something which seems to have political ramifications. If you share the same intention of someone as the king, you naturally do what he wants, and therefore you don't have to pay corvée tax. You don't have to be told what to do as a tax obligation. And at this point, absolutely everybody in the kingdom is an emanatory creation. In the beginning, it was just one monk. All right? Later, it's some soldiers and some craftsmen. Then it's all of these kings and guards and everything on those lines, and then it's everybody. Sorry, my daughter went, wow, Dad, it's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So here's what I'm arguing. The texts seem to be actually very explicit. As long as you get rid of the concept of religion and think about this as political solidarity, effectively they're making an argument for a notion of political solidarity at a state level, one that grows as the ruler's constitutional powers grow. Now, in this sense, that gives us one last thing, and I appreciate I'm almost out of time. That gives us one last thing. So, in a sense, the major argument of these early works, this kind of, and I'm going to argue that this is a sort of political treatise to a certain extent, about the nature of constitutional life under the ancient emperor. This is what the writers were trying to do. They were polemicists in this regard. One of the most interesting bits, and again, a bit that annoyed Vostrikov, was all reference to conflict is removed. War, under Songtsen Gampo, is absent. Well, okay, he threatens war. Okay, he threatens 50,000 illusory soldiers. If he can build temples, if he learns how to build temples and make laws, he can do that thing. If he gets those powers, he'll be able to do it. What's interesting in the text, however, is that his father's wars are recognized in the Pillar Testament. They are recognized in the Clear Mirror. Okay? And one does actually find this. It's a really interesting thing. Only Songtsen Gampo is the only Senpo, the great Senpo, who doesn't need war, it would seem. Okay? Now, here we need to do something subtle, because this is where I want to bring us on to later Tibetan history. The concept that I began with, Chosi Zungdrol, religion and temporal combined, is one that actually one of the first times it emerges is in something like the Pillar Testament. And it fits with many other complexities of Tibetan history that seem to say, and one gets this from the religious texts and from things like the autobiography of the fifth Dalai Lama, that make the argument that the true essence of war is not really the military. They're a kind of secondary support to ritual that evokes the gods to bring justice. That's the first thing, okay? If the gods aren't fighting for you, you're not going to win, okay? Even if you've got a lot of ones. So it's a little like Shakespeare talking about Agincourt, Henry V. Today, God fought for England, all right? And we know, going back to Talal Asad's works, that that was the legal concept of battlefield war. This is why you had a bishop come and consecrate a battlefield the night before the battle, was because that battlefield was seen as a place where a godly legal judgment would be made, carved on the bodies of the soldiers. So in this sense, the removal of, I would argue, and I would suggest, I can only suggest here, the removal of military conflict is again a foreshortening. It's removing all of those little bits like soldiers dying from the process in which a king, in his relationship to a god, Chenrezig, performs the correct rites, and that achieves the goals of the state. Okay? And it's not that those battles didn't happen, but they become subsumed in the narrative of ritual that produces good and bad and demons and gods and so on and so forth. Now, we do know that in the Tibetan history, for example, quite regularly, and here we go to Alice Travers's works, for example, very extensively covered in recent researches, the complex relationship between ritual performances of expelling rites, torlok, to cast away and foreign armies, assassinate generals, things on those lines. And they were understood as the primary thing. The soldiers were meant to carry a flag and turn up and do whatever the gods intended. And we see this in Tibetan rites to protect the state. And a very strong argument in the Ganden Potong state, in particular the Dalai Lamas, that the primary mechanism was ritual to which soldiers were merely an incidental support. This actually produces some very odd things. So, for example, here we have the 5th Dalai Lama's history of Tibet. The first is that you have to construct your enemies as demons. Well, we see that in modern political history quite a bit. You have to create, for example, the enemies, the Khalkha Choktu, for example, was driven out of his country and fell upon a sinful came upon a sinful country. His power waxed large for some time, but his heart was possessed by the black demon, so that evil thoughts and actions opposed to the Buddhist teachings in general and the teachings of Tsongkhapa, the victor in particular, worked on his mind, and therefore he became a demon and therefore could be expelled. And this works both ways. So there was a proper battle here, in this case. But most famously, and here I speak to the late Elliot Sperling's works on the subject, Elliot Sperling famously talked about the 5th Dalai Lama. Here I'll round up. The 5th Dalai Lama in 1659 had a rebellion against him by one of his ex-regents called Depa Norbu. Depa Norbu took Samdrupse Castle in Shigatse and held it, trying to overthrow the 5th Dalai Lama's rule. And the 5th Dalai Lama famously wrote a letter to his allies in which he said, "Of those in the band of enemies who have despoiled the duties entrusted to them, make the male lines like trees that have had their roots cut, make the female lines like brooks that have dried up in winter, make the children and grandchildren like eggs smashed against rocks, make the servants and followers like heaps of grass consumed by fire, make their dominion like a lamp whose oil has been exhausted. In short, annihilate any traces of them, even their name." Now, this little passage here gets regularly used in books about genocide. All right? What's interesting about it is two facts. The first is the letter is not, as actually Eliot initially said, but Samten Kame corrected him later. The letter is not a letter to his Mongol warlord allies. It was to a protector god to go and do this. And indeed, the protector god, called Seomapo, said, "I shall do this, and I shall go forth, because I am champing at the bit to go and have a battle." So he did. And indeed, the rebels were defeated, and Depa Norbu fled. Now, in this one, the 5th Dalai Lama is entirely satisfied that these orders were fulfilled. And you would think by reading that would be quite messy. In the end of the day, there was only one casualty in the entire conflict. It was one of the Dalai Lama's personal monks, and he was hit by lightning. And the gods, however, had driven away the allies, had driven away the rebels, largely by creating dust storms, which the rebels then said, during the negotiations, said, "The gods are against us." So they left. Depa Norbu himself fled to Bhutan, and his name was never heard of again until Elliot Sperling wrote about him. But there we go. So in this sense, I think one of the questions we have to ask is, how do Tibetans write about the state? How do the history, rather than separating religion out from politics, we need to say, well, is there a political way of writing which is actually remarkably similar to ours in a variety of different ways, but different in others? And we need to think carefully about that, because at the moment there is something of a danger of simply taking an indigenous Tibetan way of thinking about sovereignty and simply calling it folklore. And as many of my colleagues in Aberdeen would say, they would call that a form of conceptual colonialism. I shan't go that far, but I do think it's possibly a bit of an error. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Martin, for an eminently engaging lecture, brilliantly delivered. Thank you very much for making history so entertaining and for making us think more about the way texts, historical texts, were intended and about the way we read them, and for cautioning us a bit from reading too much into it. That is not really, was never really intended to be in these texts. So I think that it's very, very helpful for students, for scholars, for hopefully everyone in this room, just to think a bit more about the mechanics of historical writing and narrative. Thank you very much. It was brilliant.
Thank you.